A clean sweep. The phone rang, but Elvira ignored it. She and Willie had only been home long enough to unpack, and already the answering machine had picked up 6 messages. They'd agreed that tomorrow would be time enough to catch up with the outside world. It's nice to be home, she thought happily, as she stepped out onto the terrace of their Central Park South apartment and looked down at the park, where now, in late October, the leaves had turned into a blazing rainbow of orange and crimson and yellow and russet. She went back inside and settled on the couch. Willie handed her a cocktail, a Manhattan, in honor of being back in the city, and carried his own to his big easy chair. He lifted his glass to her. "To us, honey." Elvira smiled fondly at him. "I have to say, all that sightseeing does wear me out. I'm going to rest my hands and feet for at least 2 weeks," she said. "Agreed," Willie nodded, and then added sheepishly, "Honey, I still think riding those mules in Greece was a little much. I felt like a broken down Hopalong Cassidy." "Well, you looked like the Lone Ranger," Elvira assured him. "Oh." You know, they love each other.
Oh, darling.
Mm-hmm. She paused, looking lovingly at her husband.
Mm-hmm.
"Willie, we've had so much fun, haven't we? If it weren't for the lottery, I'd still be cleaning houses, and you'd be fixing busted pipes." And once again they sat in silent wonder, marveling over the wonderful event that had made a clean sweep of their former life. The dates of their birthdays and wedding anniversary were the numbers they'd always played. $1 a week for 10 years, until the unbelievable moment when the lottery ticket with those numbers was pulled and they found themselves the sole winners of the $40 million prize.
Oh my god, they're such soulmates. I love it.
You gotta dream of the fact that you can't go a single goddamn story without talking about the fact they won the lottery. I know they won the lottery, it's in the lottery book.
Shut up.
As Elvira said, "Willie, for us, life began at 60. Well, not quite 60. So far among their travels, they'd been to Europe 3 times, to South America once, had taken the Trans-Siberian Railway from China to Russia, and now had just returned from a cruise around the Greek islands." The phone rang. Elvira glanced at it. "Don't be tempted," Willie begged. "We need to get our breath. It's probably Cordelia, and she'll have a job for me, fixing the plumbing at the convent or something. It can wait a day." They listened to the answering machine. It was Rhonda Alvarez, secretary of the Manhattan chapter of the Lottery Winners Support Group. Rhonda, a founding member of the group, had won $6 million in the lottery and been persuaded by a cousin to invest her first big check in his invention, a fast-acting drain cleaner. As it turned out, the only thing the cousin's cleaner whooshed down the drain was Rhonda's money. That was when Rhonda started the support group, and when she read about how well Elvira and Willie had handled their windfall, she begged them to be honorary members and regular guest lecturers. Rhonda had already left one message. Now she got right to the point. "Elvira, I know you're home. The limo dropped you off an hour ago. I checked with your doorman. Please pick up. This is important." "And you think Cordelia's bad?" Elvira murmured as she obediently reached for the phone. Willie watched her expression change to disbelief and concern, and then heard her say, "Of course, we'll talk to her. Tomorrow morning at 10. Here. Fine." When she hung up, she explained, "Willie, we're going to meet Nellie Monahan. From what Rhonda tells me, she's a very nice woman, but much more important, she's a lottery winner who's been shafted by her ex-husband. We can't let that happen." Lottery winners to the chase. The next morning at 9 o'clock, Nellie Monahan prepared to leave her 3-room apartment in In Stuyvesant Town, the East Side housing development that she'd moved into over 40 years ago as a 22-year-old bride. Even though the rent was now 10 times more than the $59 a month that had been the starting figure, the flat was still a terrific bargain, provided, of course, that you could spend nearly $600 a month for shelter.
Oh dear, this book is old though. That's expensive.
Oh yeah, let's see.
This book's from the 80s, right?
No, the first printing was in 95.
Well, that's still I mean, it's not bad. It's not bad compared to now, but
Yes, but still.
it's expensive.
No. And of course, this story's
she's
from
in 3
92.
bedrooms. She's a 3-bedroom, right?
Yeah, well, she's a 3-room apartment.
Oh,
So that could mean,
well, still, that probably still means 900 square feet.
Yeah, so I guess that
Okay,
for
so that's pretty fucking good.
but gathered is still
That's still fucking good.
$600, and actually this story was written in 92 specifically.
Yeah,
So
that's.
that'd still be.
Well, yeah, okay,
what,
whatever. It's so
900,
everything's
1,000?
expensive. I think everything's just fucking bitching expensive.
But now that she was retired and living on a tiny pension and her monthly Social Security check, it had become painfully obvious to Nellie that she might have to give up the apartment and move in with her cousin Margaret in New Brunswick, New Jersey. To Nellie, a dyed-in-the-wool New Yorker, the prospect of spending her final years away from the Big Apple was appalling. It had been bad enough that her husband, Tim, had walked out on her, but to give up the apartment broke her heart. And then to learn that Tim's new wife had produced that winning lottery ticket, it was just too much. That was when her neighbor suggested that Nellie call the support group. And now she had a meeting with Alvira Meehan, who, Rhonda assured, was a problem solver who got things done. Nellie was a small, round, nondescript woman with vaguely pretty features and lingering traces of brown in her gray hair, whose natural wave framed her face and softened the lines that time and hard work had etched around her eyes and mouth. With her hesitant voice and shy smile, Nellie gave the outward appearance of being a pushover, but nothing could have been further from the truth. People who tried to take advantage of her soon learned that Nellie had a spunky streak and an implacable sense of justice. Until her retirement at age 60, she had worked as a bookkeeper for a small company that manufactured Venetian blinds and, some years earlier, was the one who realized that the owner's nephew was bleeding the place dry. She'd persuaded her boss to make the nephew sell his house and pay back every dime he'd stolen, or risk becoming a guest of the Department of Correction of New York. And once, when a teenager tried to grab her pocketbook as he rode past her, she'd poked her umbrella into the spokes of his bicycle, causing him to go sprawling on the road with a sprained ankle. She alternately shouted for help and lectured the would-be mugger until the police came. But these episodes paled compared to being cheated out of her nearly $2 million share of the lottery money by her husband of 40 years and her successor, Roxy, the new Mrs. Tim Monahan.
Roxy.
I.e. Roxy.
Oh.
Nellie knew that Alvira Meehan and her husband Willie lived in one of the fancy Central Park South buildings, so she dressed carefully for her meeting with them, selecting a brown tweed suit she'd bought on sale at A&S. She'd even gone to the extravagance of having her hair washed and set. Promptly at 10 a.m., she was announced by the doorman. At 10:30, Alvira poured a second cup of coffee for their guest. For half an hour, she deliberately kept the conversation general, talking about their shared backgrounds and changing life in the city. From her experience as an investigative columnist for the New York Globe, she'd learned that relaxed people tended to be better witnesses. "Now, let's get down to business," she said, touching the sunburst pin on the lapel of her jacket and turning on the recorder in it. Ah, of course, first mention. Yay. Never disappointing me. I'm going to be honest, she explained. I'll be recording our conversation because sometimes when I play it back, I pick up something that I missed. Nellie's eyes sparkled. Rhonda Alvarez told me you use that recorder to solve crimes. Well, let me tell you, I've got a crime for you, and the criminal's name is Tim Monahan. She went on to explain. In the 40 years I was married to him, he could never hold a job because he always found a reason to file suit against his current employer. Tim spent more time in small claims court than Judge Wapner. Nellie then enumerated the long list of defendants who had tangled with Tim, including the dry cleaner accused of putting a hole in an ancient pair of trousers, the bus company whose vehicle's sudden stop Tim said caused whiplash, the second-hand car dealer who refused to fix his car after the warranty expired, and Macy's, which was sued for a broken spring he discovered on a Lazy Boy recliner Nellie had given him years before.
My God, Tim.
Oh, Tim. In her gentle voice, she continued to tell them that Tim always considered himself a bit of a ladies' man, and would gallantly rush to open doors for attractive girls while she, Nellie, walked behind him like the invisible woman. It had been especially annoying when he sang the praises of Roxy Marsh, who owned the catering outfit he worked for occasionally. Nellie had met the woman once, and recognized that Roxy was the type who buttered up her help and then paid them slave wages. She went on to explain also... She went on to explain also that while Tim drank a little too much, was a pain in the neck, and looked particularly silly when he tried to act like Beau Brummel, he was nevertheless company of a sort, and after 40 years she was used to him. Besides that, she loved to cook and always enjoyed Tim's hearty appetite. It hadn't been perfect, but they had stuck it out.
Wow. This is so depressing.
It really is.
Ouch. Ladies, any of you feel like this, get a frying pan. Kidding.
Make some compliments.
Go to small claims court.
Until they did, or didn't, win the lottery. Tell me about it, Alvira ordered. We played the lottery every week, and one day I woke up feeling particularly lucky, Nellie explained earnestly. It was the last chance to get in on the lottery for an $18 million pot. Tim was between jobs, and I gave him $1 and told him to be sure to pick up a ticket when he bought his newspaper. And did he? Alvira asked quickly. Absolutely. When he got back, I asked him about it, and he said yes, he'd bought it. Did you see the ticket? Willie asked quickly. Alvira smiled at her husband. Willie was frowning. He seldom lost his temper, but when he did, he looked and sounded remarkably like his sister Cordelia. Willie would have no use for a man who cheated his wife. I didn't ask to see it, Nellie explained as she swallowed the last of her coffee. He always held the ticket in his wallet. Besides, there was no need. We always played the same numbers. So do we, Alvira told her. Our birthdays and wedding anniversary. Tim and I took ours from the street addresses of the houses we grew up in, 1802 and 1913, 10 Broke Avenue in the Bronx, and 405 East 14th Street, the number of our building all these years. That came out to be 18, 2, 19, 13, 4, and 5. Tim didn't say one word about picking different numbers. That was on Saturday. The next Wednesday I was watching TV when our numbers was pulled, and you can't imagine my shock. Yes, I can, Alvira told her. I had cleaned for Mrs. O'Keefe the day we won, and let me tell you, She had all her grandchildren in the day before, and the place was a mess. I was bone tired and soaking my feet when our numbers were pulled. She kicked over the pail, Willie explained. We spent our first 10 minutes as multimillionaires mopping up the living room. Drinking for the funny and for the fact that I would like. No one know. Does anyone know who Mrs. O'Keefe is, or does just she know? I was mopping for Mrs. O'Keefe.
That's what she always works for.
No, I know, but she says it to everyone.
Yeah,
I don't know
Miss
if-
O'Keefe is a fucking boss.
Everyone knows Miss O'Keefe, bitch.
Oh, I'm sure. Then you do understand. Nellie sighed. She went on to explain that Tim had been out that night, working his occasional job as a bartender for Roxy the caterer. Nellie had sat up waiting for him, and to celebrate had made his favorite dessert, a creme brulee. Oh my god, what a basic ass piece of shit.
God, he's disgusting.
He's a disgusting man.
It's a little sip. But when he got home, a tearful Tim handed her the ticket he was holding. It wasn't the numbers they always played. Every single one was different. I decided to change our luck, Tim told her. I thought I'd have a heart attack, Nellie said. But he felt so terrible that I ended up telling him it didn't matter, that it just wasn't to be. And I bet he ate the creme brulee, Elvira snapped.
Mm-hmm.
Every speck. He said
know.
every man should be so lucky as to have a wife like me. Then a few weeks after, he walked out on me and moved in with Roxy. He told me he'd fallen in love with her. That was a year ago. The divorce came through last month, and he married Roxy 3 weeks ago. They'd announced that there were 4 winners of the $18 million pot, and I didn't realize that one of them hadn't shown up to collect. Then last week, on the very last day before the ticket expired, Roxy, now the second Mrs. Tim Monahan, showed up at the redemption window and claimed she just happened to realize she had the 4th ticket. The ticket with the numbers Tim and I always played. Tim was working for Roxy the night your numbers won, and he had the ticket in his wallet, Elvira asked to confirm her suspicion. Yes, that's the point. He had big eyes for her all along and probably showed the ticket to her. And she's a flirt who saw her big chance, Willie said. That's disgusting. If you want to know what disgusting is, I'll show you the picture of the two of them in the Post saying how lucky they were that Roxy happened to find her ticket. Nellie's voice quivered into a near sob. Then she got a flinty look in her eye, and her jaw moved out an inch. It's not justice, she said. There's a retired lawyer, Dennis O'Shea, living down the hall from me, and I spoke to him about it. He did some research and learned that there are a couple of other cases on record where one spouse or other pulled that scam, and the court decided that the one holding the ticket is the owner. He said that it was a disgrace and a horror and a terrible shame, but legally I was out of luck. How did you happen to go to a meeting of the Lottery Winners Support Group? Elvira asked. Dennis sent me. He'd read about all the people who lost all the money they made on the lottery and bad investments and thought it might help me to be around kindred souls. Righteous wrath in her voice and a certain mulish expression around her mouth, Nellie summed up her lackless saga. Tim moved out on me faster than you can say abracadabra, and now the two of them will live the life of really while I move in with my cousin Margaret because I can't afford to stay where I am. Margaret only asked me to live with her because she likes my cooking. She talks so much I'll probably be stone deaf in a year. There's got to be a way to help, Elvira decreed. Let me put on my thinking cap. I'll call you tomorrow. At 9 o'clock the next morning, Nellie sat at the dinette table in her Stuyvesant town apartment, enjoying a warm bagel and a cup of coffee. It may not be Central Park South, she thought, but it's a wonderful place to live. Since Tim took off, she'd always made little changes in the apartment. He'd always insisted on keeping that big, ugly recliner of his right by the window, but since he'd taken it with him when he moved out, she'd arranged the rest of the furniture the way she'd always secretly wanted, and then she'd made bright new slipcovers for the couch and wing chair, and bought a lovely hooked rug for next to nothing from neighbors who were moving. Looking now at the autumn sun streaming in, and seeing how cheerful and inviting the place was, she reflected on how much more she'd come to realize that Tim had been a lifelong drag, and that she really was better off without him. The trouble was that she couldn't make ends meet without his pitiful income, and try as she did, she couldn't find a job. Who wants to hire a 62-year-old woman who can't use a computer? Answer: nobody. Margaret had already called this morning. Why don't you give the apartment up on the first and save a month's rent? I'm having the back bedroom painted for you. How about the kitchen? Nellie wondered. I bet that's where you really expect me to spend my time. It was all so hopeless. Nellie took a sip of her excellent fresh brewed coffee and sighed. Then Elvira called. We've got a plan, she said. I want you to go and see Roxy and Tim and get them to admit they shafted you. Why would they admit it? Get one of them mad enough to brag that they pulled one over on you. Do you think you can do that? Oh, I can get Roxy's goat, Nellie said. When they got married last month, I found a picture of Tim and Jones Beach where he looks like a beached whale, and I had it framed and sent it to her. On it I wrote, "Congratulations and good riddance." I like you, Nellie, Elvira chuckled. You're a woman after my own heart. Here's the plan. One way or another, you're going to make a date to see them, and you're going to wear an exact copy of my sunburst pin. My editor had a couple of extras made for me. Elvira, your pin looks valuable. It's valuable because it has a recorder in it. You're going to turn it on, get them to admit that they cheated you, and then we're going to get your lawyer friend, Dennis O'Shea, to sign a complaint to matrimonial court. Oh, yeah. Get your lawyer friend, Dennis O'Shea, to sign a complaint to matrimonial court that you were cheated out of marital assets. A faint hope stirred in Nellie's ample bosom. Elvira, do you really think there's a chance? It's about the only chance, Elvira said quietly. Oh my god, the fact that she just always is like, just make him admit it!
Also,
This is her second, third time now? Just do it. Just make him admit it. It's fine. You'll get it.
It's fine. Just go.
Just
Go.
For several minutes after getting off the phone, Nellie sat deep in thought. She remembered how a couple of years ago when Tim's mother was dying, the old woman had asked him to tell the truth. Hadn't he been the one who set the garage on fire when he was 8 years old? He'd always denied it, but that day, seeing she was breathing her last, he broke down and confessed. I know how to get to him, Nellie thought as she reached for the phone. Tim answered. When he heard her voice, he sounded irritated. Listen, Nellie, we're packing up to go to Florida for good, so what's up? Nellie crossed her fingers. Tim, I've got bad news. I don't have more than another month. And I don't, she thought, at least not in Stuyvesant Town. Tim sounded at least somewhat concerned. Nellie, that's too bad. Are you sure? Very sure. I'll pray for you. That's why I'm calling. I have to say I've had some pretty nasty thoughts about you in these weeks since Roxy turned in the lottery ticket. It was her ticket. I know. I mean, I used to tell her how we played those numbers, and she tried them for luck that week, and I tried some other combination. Her numbers? I forgot, Tim said quickly. Look, Nellie, I'm sorry, but we're leaving tomorrow, and the movers are coming in the morning. I've got a lot to do. Tim, I have to see you. I'm trying to get my soul in readiness, and I've hated you and Roxy so much. I have to see you face to face and talk to you. Otherwise, I'll never die in peace. More straight truth, Nellie thought. From the background, she heard a strident voice yell, "Tim, who the hell is that?" Tim lowered his voice and said quickly, "We're leaving on a noon plane tomorrow. Be here at 10 o'clock. But, Nellie, I have to tell you, I can only spare 15 minutes. That's all I want, Tim, Nellie said, her voice even softer than usual. She hung up the phone and dialed Elvira. He's giving me 15 minutes tomorrow morning, she said. Elvira, I could kill him. That won't do you any good, Elvira said. Come on over this afternoon and I'll show you how to work the pin.
Button.
Always with the pin. The next day at 9 o'clock, Nellie was about to put on her coat when the doorbell rang. It was Dennis O'Shea, the nice retired lawyer who lived down the hall in 8F. He'd moved there about 6 months ago. A number of times he'd fallen in step with her when they met at the elevator. He was on the small side, maybe 5'7" or so, with a neat, compact build, kindly eyes behind frameless glasses, and a pleasant, intelligent face. Good Lord, you literally are anything under 6 foot in these goddamn fucking books, and you are just automatically unattractive, and, well, at least you're somewhat, intelligent and pleasant looking.
It's not one of those goblin trolls.
He told her that his wife had died 2 years ago, and when he'd retired from the Legal Aid Society at age 65, he decided to sell the house in Soizet and move back to the city. He split his time now between the apartment and his cottage on Cape Cod. Nellie could tell that, like her, Dennis had a strong sense of justice and didn't like the underdog to be pushed around. That was why she'd had the courage to ask him for advice when Roxy turned in the winning ticket. This morning, Dennis looked worried. Nellie, he said, are you sure you know how to turn on that recorder? Oh, sure. You just sort of run your hand over the fake diamond in the center. Show me. She did. Say something. Go to hell, Tim. That's the spirit. Now play it back. She snapped the cassette out of the pin and put it in the machine Elvira had also given her, and then pushed the replay button. Nothing happened. I guess you told your friend Elvira Meehan about me, Dennis said. She called a few minutes ago and explained what's going on. She said that you seem to have trouble turning on the recorder. Why? Nellie felt her fingers tremble. She hadn't been able to sleep all night. Her share of the winnings was just maybe, possibly within her grasp. But if this didn't work, it was all over. She hadn't shed one tear all this year. But right now, looking at the concern on Dennis O'Shea's face, she felt her eyes fill up. Show me what I was doing wrong, she said. For the next 10 minutes, they tried turning the recorder on and off, saying a few words, then playing it back. The trick was to snap that little switch firmly. Finally, Nellie said, I have it. Thanks, Dennis. My pleasure, Nellie. You get them on record saying they cheated you, and I'll have them in matrimonial court so fast they won't know what hit them. But they're moving to Florida. The lottery checks are issued in New York. Let me worry about that part of it. He waited with her at the elevator. You know what bus to take. It's not that far to Christopher Street. I'll walk at least one way. Elvira had a busy morning. At 8, she started vigorously cleaning the already spotless apartment. At 8:45, she looked up Dennis O'Shea's phone number and called him, explaining her worry that Nellie might not have the hang of using the recorder. Then she got back to polishing the polished. To Willie, it was an unmistakable sign that she was deeply concerned. What's eating you, honey? He asked finally. I have a bad feeling, she admitted. You're afraid Nellie won't be able to handle the recorder? I'm worried about that, and I'm worried that she may not be able to get them to say a word. And most of all, I'm worried that they tell her everything. and she doesn't get it on tape. Nellie was meeting her ex-husband and Roxy at 10. At 10:30, Alvira sat down and stared at the phone. At 10:35, it rang. It was Cordelia, looking for Willie. "One of our old girls has a leak in her kitchen ceiling," Cordelia said. "The whole apartment is starting to smell mildewed. Send Willie right over." "Later, Cordelia. We're waiting for an important message." Alvira knew there was no getting off without explaining the problem. "You should have told me before," Cordelia snapped. "I'll start praying." By noon, Alvira was a total wreck. She called Dennis O'Shea again. "Any word from Nellie?" "No, Mrs. Meehan. Nellie told me that Tim Monahan was only going to give her 15 minutes. "I know." Finally, at 12:15, the phone rang. Alvira grabbed it. "Hello?" "Alvira." It was Nellie. Alvira tried to analyze the tone of her voice. Strained? No. Shocked. Yes, that's what it was. Shocked. Nellie sounded as though she was in a trance. "What happened?" Alvira demanded. "Did they admit it?" "Yes." "Did you get it on tape?" "No." "Oh, that's terrible. I'm so sorry." "That's not the worst of it." "What do you mean, Nellie?" There was a long pause. Then Nellie sighed. "Alvira, Tim's dead. I shot him."
Oh!
And that's my cigarette break. 5 hours later, Alvira and Willie posted bond after Dennis O'Shea, Nellie's self-appointed lawyer, pled her not guilty to charges of second-degree murder, first-degree manslaughter, and carrying a concealed weapon. Nellie rose from her trance-like lethargy only long enough to say in a surprised voice, "But I did kill him." They took her home. Half a Sara Lee crumb cake, neatly enveloped in plastic, was on the kitchen counter. "Tim always loved that cake," Nellie said sadly. "He looked awful today, even before he died. I don't think Roxy cooked much for him." Did you cook anything if you're giving him Sara Lee crumb cakes?
You know you could like something. Just shut up.
Alvira was feeling wretched. All this had been her big idea. Now Nellie was facing long years in prison. At her age, that could mean the rest of her life. Yesterday, Nellie had said that she could kill Tim. And I joked about it, Alvira thought. I told her that wouldn't do any good. I never thought she meant it. How did she happen to have a gun? She put on the kettle. "I think we better talk," she said. "But first I'll make a nice strong cup of tea for you, Nellie." Nellie told her story in a flat, emotionless voice. "I decided to walk down to Christopher Street to get my thoughts together. You know what I mean? I took the pin off and put it in my pocketbook. It's so pretty and I was afraid I'd get mugged for it. Then on 10th Street and Avenue B, I saw a couple of kids. They couldn't have been more than 10 or 11. Can you believe one of them was showing the other a gun?" "What?" She stared ahead. "Let me tell you. I saw red. Those boys were not only playing hooky, but treating that gun like a cat pistol. I marched up to them and told them to hand it over." "You what?" Dennis O'Shea blinked. The one who wasn't holding the gun said, "Shoot her!" But I think the other kid must have thought I was an undercover cop or something. Nellie continued. "Anyhow, he looked scared and handed it to me. I told them that kids their age should be in school and should play stickball, the way boys did when we were growing up." Alvira nodded. "So you had the gun with you when you went to see Tim and Roxy?" "I couldn't take time to turn it in at the police station. Tim was only giving me 15 minutes. As it turned out, I didn't need more than 10. Alvira saw that Willie was about to ask a question. She shook her head. It was obvious that Nellie was about to relive the scene in her mind. "All right, Nellie," she said softly. "What happened when you were with them?" "I was a couple of minutes late. They're making a movie on Christopher Street, and I had to push through a lot of people who were gawking at the actors. The movers were just leaving when I got there. Roxy let me in. I don't think Tim had told her I was coming. Her mouth sort of dropped open when she saw me. The living room was empty except for Tim's old recliner, and he was camped in it, as usual. Didn't even get up like a gentleman. Then Mrs. Tim Monahan II, bold as brass, says to me, 'Get lost.' I was so nervous by then that I looked right at Tim and just blurted out everything I had rehearsed. That I only had a month left and that I wanted his forgiveness for being so angry at him, that I didn't matter about the ticket, that I was glad he had someone to take care of him. But before I died, just like his mother, I wanted to hear the truth." "You told them that?" Willie exclaimed. "You're smart," Elvira breathed. "Anyhow," Tim had a funny look on his face, like he was going to laugh, and he said that it had been bothering him from the start. That yes, he had bought the winning ticket and switched it with Roxy, and he had kept it in a safe deposit box at the bank on West 4th Street until he took it out and gave it to Roxy to cash in last month, and he was sorry for my trouble, and I was a fine, generous woman. He admitted it just like that, Elvira said. So fast that I almost collapsed, and he was laughing when he said it. Now I'm pretty sure he was just making fun of me. I realized I didn't have the pin on me, and I opened my pocketbook and started to fumble for it. And Roxy yelled something about the gun, and I took it out to explain, and it went off, and Tim went down like a load of blubber. And after that, it's all vague. Roxy tried to grab the gun, and the next thing I knew, I was in the police station. She reached for her cup. "So I guess I don't have to worry about keeping this apartment, or about going to my cousin's in New Brunswick. Do you think they'll send me to the same prison where they keep that woman who had her husband shot because she wanted to keep the dog when they were divorced?" She put the cup down and slowly stood up. As Elvira and Willie and Dennis O'Shea watched, her face crumbled. "Oh my God," she said. "How could I have shot Tim?" Then she fainted. Of course. The next morning, Elvira came back from visiting Nellie in the hospital. "They're going to keep her for a few days," she told Willie. "It's just as well. The newspapers are having a field day. Take a look." She handed him the Post. The front page showed a hysterically weeping Roxy watching Tim's corpse being carried from the apartment. According to this, Roxy claims that Nellie just showed up and started shooting. "We can testify that she made an appointment with Tim," Willie said, "but Nellie did say that Roxy didn't seem to expect her." His forehead furrowed, and he considered the situation. "Dennis O'Shea phoned while you were out. He thinks it would be a good idea to plea bargain." Elvira flicked a piece of lint from the sleeve of her smartly tailored pantsuit. It was an outfit she usually enjoyed wearing. It was only a size 14, and she could close the button at the waist of the slacks without too much yanking. But today nothing could give her comfort. Nellie may have been cheated out of her lottery ticket, but I'm the one who gave her a ticket to prison, she thought. I've been thinking that if I could possibly find those kids Nellie took the gun from, it would at least prove that she didn't intend to go there with it. I made her describe them to me. The thought of action brought a little relief. I'd better change into some old dud so I can just hang around. That isn't a great neighborhood. An hour later, wearing ancient jeans, a tired Mickey Mouse sweatshirt, and her sunburst pin, Alvira took up her vigil on the corner of Avenue B and 10th Street. The boys Nellie had described were about 10 or 11 years old. One was short and thin, with curly hair and brown eyes. The other was taller and heavy-set. They both had duck haircuts and wore gold chains and an earring. The odds of just running into them were small, and after 30 minutes Alvira began to systematically work her way through the neighborhood stores. She bought a newspaper in one, 2 apples in another, aspirin in the drugstore. In each place she began a conversation. It was with the shoemaker that she finally hit pay dirt. "Sure, I know those two. The little guy is big trouble. The other isn't a bad kid. They usually hang around that corner." He pointed out the window. "This morning the cops were picking up truants and taking them back to school, so I guess they won't be here till 3 o'clock. Delighted with the information, Alvira rewarded the shoemaker by purchasing an assortment of polishes, none of which she needed. As he slowly counted out change, he explained that he'd dropped and stepped on his reading glasses, but that at a distance he could see a gnat sneeze. Then, glancing past her, he exclaimed, "They're the kids you're looking for." He pointed across the street. "They must have sneaked out of school again." Alvira spun around. "Forget about the change," she called as she dashed out the store. An hour later, she dejectedly related to Willie and Dennis O'Shea what had happened. "When I talked to them, they'd just seen Nellie's picture in the Post and recognized her. Those little skunks were on their way to the police station to report that Nellie came up to them and asked where she could buy a gun because she needed one right away and offered them $100. They claimed they didn't know where to get one, but later some other kid bragged about selling one to her." "That's a damn lie," Dennis said flatly. "Just before Nellie left her apartment yesterday morning, she checked her wallet. I couldn't help but notice she didn't have more than $3 or $4 in it. Why would those kids lie like that?" "Because Nellie took their gun away," Alvira told him, "and this is their chance to get even." She realized she did not know why Dennis had been sitting in the living room talking to Willie when she arrived home, but when he told her the reason, she was sorry she'd asked. The autopsy was complete. One bullet had grazed Tim's forehead. The other 2 had lodged in his heart, and from the angle of entry it was clear they'd been fired after he was lying on the floor. The district attorney had called Dennis to tell him the plea bargain was now first-degree aggravated manslaughter with a minimum of 15 years in prison. Take it or leave it. "And when I spoke to him, he hadn't heard from those kids," Dennis concluded. "Does Nellie know about this yet?" Alvira asked. "I saw her this morning, just after you left. She intends to check out the hospital tomorrow and get her affairs in order. She said she has to pay for her crime." "I kind of hate to bring this up," Willie offered, "but is it possible that Nellie did buy the gun and was mad enough to mean to kill Tim? She pointed the gun at his heart when he was on the floor," Alvira exclaimed. "I can't believe it." "I don't think she did it deliberately," O'Shea agreed. "But she did kill him. Her prints are on the gun." He got up. "I'd better call and get the plea bargain in motion. I'll see if they'll give Nellie a little time before she has to start serving her sentence." "He likes Nellie," Willie observed when he'd let Dennis O'Shea out. "He's the kind of man she should have been with all these years," Alvira agreed. Suddenly she felt old and tired. "I'm just a meddling fool," she thought. Once again she could hear herself advising Nellie to go see Tim, and she could also hear Nellie saying, "I would kill him," or "I could kill him." Willie patted her hand, and she looked up at him gratefully. He was her best friend as well as the best husband in the world. Poor Nellie had put up with a guy who couldn't hold a job, who fought with everyone, who drank too much, and who was the size of a beached whale. Why the heck did Roxy marry him? For the ticket, of course. That night, Alvira could not sleep. Over and over, she considered every single detail, and it all added up to one thing. 15 years in prison for Nellie Monahan. Finally, at 2 o'clock, she got out of bed, being careful not to disturb Willie, who was clearly in the second stage of sleep. A few minutes later, armed with a steaming pot of tea, she sat at the dining table and played back the recording she had made of the first meeting with Nellie and then her confession after they bailed her out. She was missing something. What was it? She got up, went to the desk, got a spiral notebook and pen, returned to the table, and rewound the tape. Then as she played it back, she took notes. When he got up at 7 o'clock, Willie found her poring over her notes. He knew what she was doing. He put on the kettle and settled at the table across from her. "Can't figure out what you're missing," he commented. "Let me take a look." A half hour passed, and then Willie said, "I can't see anything, but reading about Tim's recliner makes me think of old Buster Kelly. Remember, he had a recliner too. He even insisted on moving it into the nursing home with him." "Willie, say that again." "Buster Kelly insisted on moving his recliner?" "Willie, that's it. Tim was sitting in his recliner when Nellie went to the apartment." Alvira reached across the table and grabbed her notebook. "Look, Nellie says that the moving men were just pulling away when she got there. Why didn't the recliner go with them?" She jumped up. "Willie, don't you see? Tim had a reason for telling Nellie he'd cheated her. I bet you anything Roxy had just told him to go stuff it. She stuck with him until he handed her the lottery ticket and she turned it in. Then she didn't need him anymore." The more she said, the surer Alvira was that she'd hit the nail on the head. Her voice rose in excitement as she continued. "Tim was trying to keep Nellie from claiming a share in the ticket and never thought that Roxy would double-cross him. I'll bet her telling those moving men to leave the recliner was the first notice he'd gotten that Roxy was going to dump him. And by admitting to Nellie that he'd cheated her, he thought he'd get the ticket back and have half the money. It makes sense," Willie agreed. "Nellie didn't kill Tim. That first bullet just grazed his forehead. Roxy didn't grab her hand to take the gun away, but to aim it at Tim." They stared at each other. Willie's eyes shone with admiration. "Smartest redhead in the world," he said. "There's just one problem, honey. How are you going to prove it?" How was she going to prove it? Alvira made a list of where to start. She wanted to talk to the movers who had cleared out Roxy's apartment. Tim had told Nellie he'd kept the lottery ticket in a safe deposit box in a bank around the corner from Christopher Street. She wanted to find it and see when he took out the box and whose name was on it. Finally, she wanted to talk to the superintendent of the building where Roxy and Tim had their little love nest. Yet, even as her brain busily worked away, it was with an overriding sense that she was spinning wheels. The fact remained that it would be almost impossible to prove that Roxy had guided Nellie's hand. At 9 o'clock, she called Charlie Evans at the Globe. She explained her needs. At 10, he called back. Stalwart Van Company had picked up the contents of Roxy and Tim's apartment, he reported. The 3 guys assigned to the job were working on East 50th Street today. The Greenwich Savings Bank on West 4th had a safe deposit box in the name of Timothy Monahan. He rented it last year and closed it out 3 weeks ago. "They're willing to talk to you." Alvira wrote swiftly. "Charlie, you're a doll." Then hung up and turned to Willie. "Come on, honey." Their first stop was at East 50th Street, where Stalwart Van movers were dismantling an apartment. They hung around the van until 3 returned, struggling under the weight of a 9-foot brake front. Elvira waited until they hoisted it into the cave-like back of the truck, then introduced herself. I won't take a minute of your time, but it's important I ask a few questions. Willie opened his wallet and displayed 3 $20 bills.
Oh.
They cheerfully explained that Tim hadn't been in the apartment when they got there. In fact, when he did come back just before 10, they could tell he wasn't expected. Roxy had yelled, I told you to get a haircut. You look like a slob. The burly mover chuckled. Then he said something about having an appointment at 10 that he didn't think she'd like. And she said, What appointment? To fix yourself a drink? We were on the way back out the door, and the guy yelled at us to come back and get his recliner, and the wife told us to just get going. The smallest mover, the one who had carried the heaviest part of the brake front, volunteered. And in court it wouldn't prove anything, Willie reminded Elvira an hour later when they left the Greenwich Savings Bank. Having confirmed that Tim Monahan rented a safe deposit box a year ago, the morning after the disputed winning ticket was drawn, and visited it only once, the day he gave it up 3 weeks ago. That day he'd been accompanied by a flashy-looking woman. The clerk identified Roxy's picture. That's the one. He went into the vault and gave up that safe deposit box half an hour before they showed up at the clerk's office to turn in the ticket, Elvira said, every inch of her throbbing with frustration. I know they did, Willie agreed, but legally it doesn't prove anything. Oh, Willie, it may not do any good, but let's try to get a look at the apartment they lived in. They turned the corner and were treated to a crowd of spectators pressing against stanchions as they watched Tom Cruise catch up with a fleeing Demi Moore and spin her around. Nellie said they were filming a scene here the other day, Elvira commented. Well, we've got better things to do than gawk. She was at the door of 101 Christopher Street when a familiar voice yelled, Aunt Elvira! She and Willie spun around as a thin young man with half glasses on the end of his nose expertly made his way to them. Brian, as I live and breathe. Brian was the son of Willie's deceased sister, Madeline, now a successful playwright. To Willie and Elvira, he was the son they never had. I thought you were in London, Elvira said as she hugged him. I thought you were in Greece. I just got back, and they wanted some additional dialogue. I wrote the screenplay for this epic. He nodded to the cameras down the street. Look, I've got to get back over there. I'll catch you later. An overhead camera anchored to a van was being positioned down the block. Subconsciously, Elvira made note of it as she rang the superintendent's bell at 101. 10 minutes later, she and Willie were being shown the 3-bedroom apartment where the late Tim Monahan had breathed his last. You're in luck, the superintendent informed them. Roxy just called yesterday to say she didn't want the apartment anymore, so nobody knows if it's available. And you're the kind of tenants the manager wants. He added virtuously as he thought of Elvira's check for $1,000 nestled in his hip pocket. You mean she wasn't going to give it up when she moved to Florida? No, she said it might be needed, but she'd switched it to Tim's name. The late Tim Monahan's battered recliner caught the morning sun. The rest of the room was empty. The remains of the chalk marks on the floor the police had made to indicate where Tim's body had lain were still visible. A shadow passed over the chair. Startled, Elvira turned and was treated to the side of the Mirage Films van with the camera passing outside. That's it, she said. The next morning, Nellie Monahan sat on a chair in her room in Lenox Hill Hospital, waiting to be discharged. On her lap, she had a lined pad on which she was making notes of everything she had to do before she went to prison. A saddened Dennis O'Shea had told her that the district attorney would only let her plead guilty to a lesser offense if she would accept 15 years in prison without the possibility of parole. It's only justice, she'd told him quietly. I must pay for what I did. Then when he took her hand, she'd winced. Her wrist was sore. probably because Roxy had tried so hard to wrestle the gun from her, and there was a scrape on her index finger from where she'd scratched it, trying to turn on the recorder and the pin. Then Dennis said he thought they should go to trial, and he'd represent her, but she said it wouldn't be right for her to get off. She had taken a life. Give up apartment, Nellie wrote now. Turn off phone. She looked up. A smartly dressed Alvira was at the door. You look nice, Alvira, she said admiringly. Do you know what color the prison uniforms are? It's funny. Last night I was just lying awake thinking about things like that. Don't worry about prison uniforms, Alvira told her. It ain't over till it's over. Now, I'm going to take you home in a taxi, and I called Dennis and said you were not, repeat, not going near the district attorney's office or signing anything until I put my plan in action, starting with interviewing the heartbroken widow of the late Tim Monahan. Roxy Marsh Monahan debated about what to wear for her meeting with Alvira Meehan. It was exciting to think of having a whole article written about her in the Globe. She'd loved the story in the Post, but was sorry she hadn't had her hair done Monday the way she'd planned. It had looked a little stringy in the picture of her watching Tim's body being carried out. But on the other hand, she'd been crying hysterically, so maybe it was better that her hair was going every which way. Kind of rounded out the effect. She glanced around. The junior suite in the Omni Park Hotel was very attractive. She'd rented it the day of the shooting. The district attorney's office had asked her to stay in New York for a short time while all the facts of the case were settled. They told her that Nellie was undoubtedly going to cop a plea, so there wouldn't be any trial. Roxy decided that in a way she'd miss New York, but she loved golf, and in Florida could play it every day without worrying about rattling dishes for some dreary party. Catering was hell. God, she didn't think she'd ever cook so much as a string bean for herself again. She smiled. She'd been wrapped in a warm glow of anticipation ever since that dumb bunny, Tim, had handed her the ticket just as they went into the lottery office. Actually, Tim wasn't so dumb. That first night when he'd showed her the winning ticket, she'd offered to hold it for him. No way, he told her. He wanted to make sure that they were really compatible. She'd been stuck with having to look at that dopey face every day, listen to him snore at night, see him plopped in that shabby recliner with a beer in his hand, act happy when he slobbered all over her with clumsy kisses. She'd earned every nickel of 200,000 or so bucks, less taxes, she had coming in each year for the next 20 years. She held up the 2 black suits she'd bought in Annie Says yesterday. One had gold buttons, the other sequin lapels. Gold buttons it would be.
Oh.
The sequins looked a little too festive. Roxy dressed, put on her customary bangles and turquoise rings. She knew she didn't look 53. She knew that with her blonde hair and snazzy figure, she was still very attractive, and now she could afford to stay that way. It all added up to catching a really interesting guy. Thank you, Tim Monahan. Thank you. Nellie Monahan. Incredible, the way I snatched victory from the jaws of defeat, Roxy exulted. Her one blunder had been to tell Tim the truth when he saw that movers were leaving and his recliner was still squatting in the living room. She could have bluffed it out somehow. She certainly would have kept her mouth shut if she'd known that Nellie Monahan would ring the doorbell seconds after she told Tim to jump in the lake, that he wasn't going with her. As Roxy reshaped her lips, the phone rang. Alvira Meehan was in the lobby. Our angle is to talk about how the winning lottery ticket has led to such tragedy for you. Alvira sympathized as she sat opposite Roxy a few minutes later. Roxy dabbed at her eyes. I'm sorry, I found it in my makeup drawer. I came across it under a box of Q-tips, and I just read an article about how a lot of people don't realize they have a winning ticket and never know they might have been millionaires, and the number to call was listed. So I laughed and said to Tim, wouldn't it be a gasser if this was a lucky ticket? Alvira turned slightly so that the recorder and her sunburst pin wouldn't miss a word. And what did he say? Oh, that silly darling said, "Don't waste the phone. Call unless it's an 800 number." Roxy squeezed tears from her eyes. "I'm sorry. Now, I did." "You'd rather be catering, wouldn't you?" "Yes." Roxy sobbed. "Yes." Alvira never used vulgar language, but a familiar vulgarity almost escaped her lips. Instead, through gritted teeth, she managed to say, "I have just a few more questions, and then our photographer wants to take some pictures." Roxy's sobs ended abruptly. "Let me check my makeup." Mel Levine, the top photographer from the Globe, had his marching orders. Get good close-ups of her hands. Willie's oldest living sibling, Sister Cordelia, did not like to be left out of anything. Knowing that Alvira was involved with Nellie Monahan, the woman who had shot her ex-husband in the presence of his second wife, made Cordelia decide to pay an unannounced visit to Central Park South. Accompanied by Sister Maeve Marie, a young policewoman turned novice, Cordelia had arrived at the apartment and was ensconced in the wing chair in the living room wherein so many words. Fine. Cordelia had arrived at the apartment and was ensconced in the wing chair in the living room when Alvira arrived home. Since the chair was upholstered in handsome crimson velvet, and Cordelia still wore an ankle-length habit and short veil, Alvira had the immediate and familiar thought that if a woman pope were ever elected, she would look like Cordelia. "Cordelia just dropped by," Willie explained, his right eyebrow lifted. That was a signal he hadn't brought Cordelia up to date on their plans. "I hope it's not an inconvenience, Alvira," Sister Maeve Marie apologized. "Sister Superior felt you might need our help." Maeve had the slender, disciplined body of an athlete. Her face, dominated by wide gray eyes, was strikingly handsome. Like Willie's, her expression was saying, "Sorry, Alvira, but you know Cordelia." "So what's going on?" Cordelia asked, getting straight to the point. Alvira knew there was absolutely no other choice than to tell her the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She sank down on the couch, wishing she'd had time for a peaceful cup of tea with Willie before the visit. "We have to get Nellie off. It's my fault that she went to see Tim, and I can't let her spend the rest of her life in prison." Cordelia nodded. "So what are you going to do about it?" "Something you may not like. Brian wrote a screenplay for Mirage Films." "I know that. I hope you can trust them not to put a lot of smut in it. What's that got to do with Nellie Monahan's poor soul?" The day of the shooting, Mirage was filming a scene right outside the building where Roxy and Tim Monahan lived. We're going to try to make Roxy believe that the camera caught her twisting Nellie's hand and pointing the gun at Tim. "You're going to fake it." Cordelia exploded. "Exactly. Brian got the producer to agree to corporate. Mel, the Globe photographer, took a lot of pictures of Roxy today. Besides that, we have pictures of her when Tim's body was being carried out. We've got to find a model who in a blurry long shot resembles Roxy. We'll dress her in the same kind of striped pantsuit Roxy was wearing and do a close-up of her grabbing Nellie's hand. I still have to talk to Nellie into this, but I'll manage it." Willie gave her an encouraging nod and continued the explanation. "Cordelia, we've already put a deposit in the apartment. The only furniture in the room was Tim's recliner, and it's still there. The check marks where the body was lying are visible. I'll take Tim's part. I'll stretch out on the floor by the recliner. Nellie said Tim was wearing a gray sweatsuit and moccasins." Sister Maeve Marie's eyes were snapping with excitement. "When I was a cop, we called that, if I could read, that would be great. I don't know what we call it. Test-a-lying? That's how it's spelled, test-a-lying. When I was a cop, we called that test-a-lying. I love it." Willie looked at Cordelia. He knew Alvira had every intention of carrying out her scheme. Even so, it would help if Cordelia wouldn't try to throw a monkey wrench in the plans. Elvira was worried enough about having set up the scheme that got Nellie in so much trouble. When Cordelia didn't approve of course action, she had an uncanny way of convincing you it was destined for failure. Cordelia frowned momentarily, then her brow cleared. God writes straight and crooked lines, she said. When are we going to film? Elvira felt a wave of relief. As soon as possible. We've got to find an actress who can impersonate Roxy. As she spoke, she was looking at Sister Maeve Marie. Like Roxy, Maeve was tall and had a good figure. Like Roxy, her hands were well shaped with long fingers. I'm very glad you two came, she said heartily. 2 days later, they were ready to close the trap. In the Christopher Street apartment where Tim Monahan had gone to his maker, Brian was directing the action. Uncle Willie, just lie down there. We had to erase the chalk marks, but we penciled in the outline. Obediently, Willie stretched out by the recliner. Brian and the cameraman stepped outside, and Brian peered through the lens, then consulted the picture of the dead Tim that the editor at the Globe had managed to get copied by bribing an aide in the medical examiner's office. You don't look fat enough, Brian decreed. Good news, Willie mumbled. The problem was solved when Brian took off his sweater and stuffed it under Willie's sweatshirt. Nellie was standing in the corner. She was wearing the blue suit and print blouse she'd worn when she visited Tim and Roxy. In her purse, she was carrying a gun that looked just like the one that she had taken from the boys the other day. Only 4 days ago, she thought. It doesn't seem possible. She peeked over at Dennis O'Shea, who gave her an encouraging smile. Then she glanced at Sister Maeve, who looked unnervingly like Roxy. She had on a blonde wig and an exact copy of the striped suit Roxy had been wearing when she became the Widow Monahan. An outsized turquoise ring reached the knuckle of her index finger. Acrylic blood red fingernails accentuated her long fingers, and wrinkles and liver spots had been painted on the backs of her hands, just like Roxy. Nellie thought with a touch of satisfaction as she glanced down at her own smooth skin. Sister Cordelia was watching the proceedings with her arms folded. She reminded Nellie of the nuns she'd been in parochial school. Brian asked if she was ready. When she nodded that she was, he said, Then go to the door, Nellie. Try to do everything just as you did the other day. She looked at Willie. Then you can't be dead yet. As he struggled to his feet, she went to the door. Roxy, let me in, she explained. Tim was sitting in his chair. I could tell he was very upset, but I thought it was at me, or maybe even because I had told him about being terminal. Anyhow, I just walked past Roxy and went over to him, and just blurted out that I wanted the truth before I died. Do it, Brian ordered. Maeve, you go to the door. Nellie had rehearsed the speech she made to Tim so much that it wasn't hard to stand over the recliner and deliver it again. It wasn't hard to superimpose Tim's face over Willie's, but Willie looked concerned. You should start smiling, she instructed. It was very mean of you, and you shouldn't have smiled when I told you I was dying. Oh my God, Elvira thought. Maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree. But then I forgave you, because right away you admitted that you'd switched the ticket. Nellie opened her purse, and I almost fainted because I remembered I didn't have the sunburst pin on, and I opened my purse and started fumbling in it like this, and Roxy saw the gun. She paused. Wait a minute. Roxy was yelling at Tim to shut up, but when she opened the door for me, she had just said something else to him. It's not important, Brian said quickly. We're not doing audio. Nellie felt as though she was watching the replay of a videotape. It was all coming back. She grabbed the pin at the bottom of her purse, and, like an echo, she could hear Roxy scream about the gun. I let go of the pin and grabbed the gun and pulled it out and tried to show it to her. Tim jumped up. The gun went off. Tim yelled. What did he yell? Nellie, don't go wacko. We'll split the ticket. Then he dove for the floor. He dove for the floor, Elvira thought. He didn't fall. He dove. It was all clear to Nellie. She thought she'd shot him and started to faint, then felt a hand close on hers, her wrist being wrenched. That's why my wrist hurts. That's why it happened. I'm sure of it now. But Tim had said something else, she thought. What was it? Roxy. He said something to Roxy. She felt Sister Meave twist her hand and point the gun down at Willie, now acting out his part on the floor. That was when I fainted. She let her knees cave in and sank to the floor. That was very good, Nellie, Brian said. I can't believe we did it on a first take, but I think we have it. We'll just play it back to be sure. Then hope to God Roxy won't see through the trick.
Yeah. I think I know what I look like. Just a thought.
Nellie sat up. She reached for her purse and dug in it for the pen, which she had failed to return to Elvira. I wonder, she said. Elvira experienced that wonderful moment when instinctively she knew something important was about to happen. What is it, Nellie? She asked. Just now, it was as though I was hearing Dennis teaching me how to turn on the pin. He told me that I had to give it a hard snap with this finger. She held up the index finger on her right hand. And that finger has been bothering me since I was here the other day. Do you think I might have turned on the recorder just before I tried to show Roxy the gun? I never checked it. Do you think it might have picked up Tim's voice pleading for his life? Saints preserve us, Cordelia breathed. Didn't even check to just see.
Also, how hard is it to turn this pin? They spent like a whole page talking
My
about how
fingy
it's
hurts. It's so hard. I don't understand. The switch of the recorder in the pin Elvira had given Nellie was still in the on position. The battery was dead, of course. But Elvira expertly took out the tiny cassette, switched it to her pocket machine, rewound it, and pushed the playback button. Cordelia's lips moved in silent prayer as Elvira turned it on. The sound began immediately. A shot. Tim's voice telling Nellie not to go wacko. Nellie saying, oh my, oh I'm sorry. Then a harsh voice. Roxy's voice. Tim, you bastard. And finally Tim's pleading, Roxy, don't shoot me. Elvira felt Willie's arm around her. You've done it again, honey. 2 nights later, Nellie insisted on cooking the celebration dinner for the 6 of them. Elvira and Willie, Sister Cordelia, and Maeve Marie, and Dennis and herself. As a former policewoman, Maeve had insisted that with the weight of evidence, the district attorney should be brought in on the scam, and one of his best undercover agents, posing as the cameraman who'd captured the shooting, had contacted Roxy. When Roxy saw the videotape and heard Tim's voice pleading with her not to shoot him, she had immediately offered the undercover agent whatever he wanted to sell it to her. Then, under his skillful questioning, she admitted everything. Now Roxy was under indictment and Nellie was vindicated and declared the rightful owner of the lottery ticket.
Whoa.
Dennis had brought champagne. With moist eyes, Nellie acknowledged their toast and then raised one of her own. To all of you and to Brian, I'm sorry he has to be in Hollywood tonight, what with the earthquakes and everything. Let's see here. It's all so unbelievable, she said a few minutes later as she watched Dennis carve the succulent saddle of lamb she'd prepared with her own special recipe. The rest of the meal consisted of tomato and onion salad, mashed potatoes, crisp green beans, flaky biscuits, mint jelly, warm apple pie, and coffee.
I got the PTSD!
Nellie beamed as she accepted their compliments. At 9 o'clock, Cordelia and Maeve got up to go. Willie, I'll see you first thing in the morning, Cordelia ordered. Bring your toolbox. I've got a bunch of jobs for you. We're ready to go too. We'll drop you off, Willie told her. I'm not setting foot out here until I help Nellie clean up, Elvira announced firmly, then felt Willie's shoe tap hers. She turned, following his gaze. Nellie and Dennis were smiling into each other's eyes. It's time to go home, honey, Willie said firmly as he put his hands on the back of her chair. And that's the end of that story.
Oh. Very cool. The end.